So I will turn it over to Bob. Thank you.
I think I'm on. Hey, welcome to everyone this morning. I think most of us were here last week, but I know there are a few that were not. So welcome to everyone, as well as those who may be streaming with us to this circle of reflection. I'd like to read on the top of the sheet that hopefully you each have a copy of this morning's readings, just to give a little explanation of what the intended design for our time together is. So I'm going to read the first couple of paragraphs here. During these first 3 Sundays of the season of Lent, the adult education focus is on instances during and meanings rooted in Holy Week, the week between Jesus' Palm Sunday entry into Jerusalem and his resurrection on Easter. Accompanying each Sunday's gospel text are 1 or 2 readings based on memories from my experiences in preparation for and engagement in pastoral ministry. The hope is that the scriptural texts and readings will prompt reflection around the circle of all present each Sunday, as well as those who are streaming. If they'd like to send messages to Judy, she can pass them along to us when we have our time for sharing. Though I am willing to answer any clarifying questions about my readings, it is my hope and that of the adult education ministry team that all present will feel at liberty to ponder aloud whatever the scriptural text and its accompanying readings may elicit. Just a word, we're going to do something slightly different compared to last week. When I was preparing this particular week's reading selection, I found myself, as I think you'll find it too, that this reading is extremely hard. And when we are done with it and have an opportunity to process what we have heard, what I decided to do is I'm going to have a moment of silence as we did last week, but I'm going to have played for us to listen to a piece by John Rutter, who is an accomplished British composer. Many of us have probably heard some of his music. I think we've had some of it sung here at Hope Church. The piece is entitled Pie Jesu, and the lyrics of it in Latin and the English translation are found at the end of the reading. So after the reading is done, Ken very graciously has agreed to hit play, and we're going to listen to it quietly for about 4 minutes. And then subsequent to that, we'll have opportunity to share comments around the circle to the extent that any of us feel led to do so. If not, in contrast to last week when clearly some nerves were hit by the reading and we had a significant number of comments shared, if the comments are relatively few in number, then somewhere around 10:20 or 10:25, if it seems appropriate, I'm prepared to read the piece from last week that we didn't read. But that's not the goal. That's simply as a backup in case we have found that conversation has ended. I'm going to invite us to share briefly a moment in prayer. Let's pray. Gracious God, bless our hearts and our minds as we attend to not only what you say to us from the cross, but who you are for us in our midst this day. We pray in your name. Amen. The scripture reading this morning comes from the 23rd chapter of Luke, and the words are these. On Good Friday, 2 others also, who were criminals, were led away to be put to death with Jesus. When they came to the place that is called the Skull, they crucified Jesus there with the criminals, one on his right and one on his left. Then Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. It was now about noon, and darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m, while the sun's light failed, and the curtain of the temple was torn in 2. Then Jesus, crying with a loud voice, said, Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. Having said this, he breathed his last. This piece I've entitled Unspeakable, and I wrote it, as you'll see, a little less than a year ago on Good Friday of the year 2022. For what will become all too obvious to the reader, this chapter of my memoir, Recollections, has proven to be one of the most difficult for me to script. It has to do with unspeakable pain and with enduring love. It was 6:01 a.m. this morning, Good Friday of my 68th year on earth. I awakened just enough to roll over in bed, hoping for another hour of sleep before rising for the day. That's when the pain hit. My left leg's long calf muscle, for whatever inexplicable reason, cramped. If memory serves, it's been months, if not years, since I've experienced a calf cramp of such extreme intensity. For any and all who have had similar muscle cramps, it's likely that pain is all too familiar. The pain was sharp and immediate, and my unconscious reaction was to moan, if not groan. From comparable past episodes, I remembered quickly my need to flex my toes upward, allowing the muscle to relax. With that goal in mind, I managed to shove the covers off my lower torso, sit up in bed, and force my aching leg to allow my toes to do their flexing thing. Gratefully, some 10 to 15 seconds into the episode, my toes cooperated, my calf muscle relaxed, and the pain eased up significantly. For the better part of a minute, I opted not to move for fear of triggering another cramping assault. None came, prompting me carefully, oh so carefully, to lie back down, head on pillow, limbs as relaxed as possible. The pain had essentially disappeared, but the anxiety about its possible return, it waned far more slowly. There I lay from 6:02 until sometime after 7 o'clock. That hour was quiet, but my mind and my soul not quiet in the least. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, pondering that oh so brief but oh so distressing pain. And as I did so, I revisited the moving Maundy Thursday service my wife and I had attended not even a dozen hours earlier in our home church, here, Hope Church. I replayed the scenes depicted in the various gospel passages read aloud during the worship hour. Jesus sharing in the sobering Passover meal with his disciples, initiating what we now call the Lord's Supper. Jesus agonizingly praying a few hours later in Gethsemane, asking that what lay in store for him might be taken away, but only if that be the divine one's will. Jesus being betrayed, abandoned, and denied by his own. Jesus being unjustly tried and brutally scourged, and then made to carry his own cross to Golgotha. Jesus being stripped and then nailed to that cross. And Jesus then hanging in agony on that cross for at least 3 excruciating hours until he, quote, breathed his last, unquote. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, feeling a kind of spiritual embarrassment. The pain I had just experienced had lasted barely 15 seconds. It had resolved almost instantaneously. But the pain Jesus had endured 2 millennia ago, the comparison caused me to lie there mute and humbled. And as I lay there, a memory flooded back from 35 years earlier. It was mid-February of 1987. Ash Wednesday was fast approaching, and with it the season of Lent, culminating in the week the church has come rightly to call holy. I had for several weeks begun to do the requisite outlining of sermon possibilities for this meaning-filled season of the church year, and that's when I found the magazine in my church mailbox on a Monday morning. Nathan, a member of the congregation, had left for me the February issue of a scientific journal to which he subscribed. On the cover, I found a post-it note. It read, quote, "Pastor Bob, I think you'll find the article that starts on page 18 of serious interest," close quote. I took the journal into my study. After sorting through my weekly to-do list, I began to read the article and found myself transfixed. The article was authored by two physiologists, experts in the field of living organisms and their parts. Their focus in this piece? Crucifixion, as horrifically designed by the Persian and Roman empires, among others, going all the way back to the 6th century BCE. The authors, who self-identified in their article as Christian, described over several lengthy pages the bitterly cruel dynamics of being crucified. They detailed how the perpetrators of this heinous act melded together two basic elements in order to maximize the pain and agony of the victims. They noted that victims were impaled in such a way as to cause them to die, not by bleeding to death, but by suffocating to death. Hanging on the cross, the physiologists noted, caused victims to sag so low as to put weighty pressure on the diaphragm, thereby impeding their ability to take a full breath. Victims had to pull down on their wrists and push up on their feet in order not to suffocate. But the nails impaling the wrists and feet were localized in such a way as to cause unspeakable pain in doing so. The net result, according to the physiologists, the crucified persons, desperate to breathe, caused themselves additional pain by pulling down on their wrists and pushing up on their feet. And ultimately, most cruelly of all, the victims were the ones who made the decision when to die, be it from utter exhaustion or excruciating pain. At the last, they chose to end their own life by ending the pulling and pushing, all while being observed passively and masochistically by those who had nailed them to the crosses in the first place. I read the article through in its entirety. I sat at my desk, both nauseated and enraged, not at the authors, nor at Nathan for having seen fit to leave it for me in my mailbox. I was nauseated by the sheer demonic nature of this human travesty, and enraged by the image of countless victims of the travesty over too many centuries. Then, of course, as Nathan intended, I found myself thinking of Jesus on the cross, of his hanging between two other comparable victims of this monstrous act, of his writhing in pain, his wrists, ankles in unending distress, of his pulling and pushing up, trying to get his next breath before asphyxiation overtook him, and of his speaking through it all, at least in 7 instances during those interminably cruel 3 hours before he died. Sitting immobile at my desk, it was those 7 instances, what the church has come to call his last words, that then drew my quiet consideration. It hit me that I had never, ever read those words in a physiologically accurate manner. I had never read them, be it silently to myself or aloud to a gathered congregation in the sanctuary, in a manner even mildly similar to their historical essence. To the contrary, for example, when I read Luke 23, verse 34. I had always read Jesus' words, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing, without stopping. I had always read that astonishing prayer as if Jesus had been able to intone it without catching his breath. But he could never have done so, not while crucified, desperate for each and every breath. Far more likely, Jesus would have been heard to gasp out, Father. Then pull and push. Breathe in, and only then breathe out with a painful gush of air. Forgive. Then again, pull up and push. Breathe in, and only then breathe out, saying, them. The whole prayer, spoken in Aramaic or Hebrew, 12 words in English, likely lasted the better part of a minute of exhausting effort, given the demands already being made on the one offering that prayer for those looking up at him from the foot of his cross. I sat with the journal article on my desk for the better part of that Monday morning. I confess I was unsure what to do with it. The following morning arrived, and I headed off for my weekly meeting with my village's dear Lutheran and Catholic pastoral counterparts. Still unsettled by what the article had stirred within me over the previous 24 hours, I shared with Keene and Bob the essence of the author's description of crucifixion. When I finally stopped talking, to my shock, Keene said, well, that's what you need to preach about at our village's ecumenical Good Friday service in April. I looked at Keene in disbelief, saying, you think I should share in gruesome detail from the pulpit what the article discloses about what Jesus truly went through on the cross? I asked. No, he responded, you shouldn't do it from the pulpit. You should do it from out in the middle of the chancel with nothing between you and the congregation, and you should do it without a robe so everyone can see clearly your arms, your torso, and your legs. I stared at Keene, slack-jawed, and he then said, this is enormously important, Bob, and I sincerely believe it's for you to do, for yourself and for all of us. Father Bob, the Catholic priest, nodded in solemn agreement. Some 2 months later, I stood before the ecumenical collection of nearly 150 worshipers, ages 5 to 95, on that Good Friday. And I did as Keene and Bob had urged me to do. I described, as the physiologists did, what it was like for Jesus as he hung on the cross, laboring in tortured pain to keep breathing, one breath at a time. I was anxious beyond measure that one or more in attendance might inform me after the service that this disclosure of the harshest realities of Jesus' crucifixion was too much for them. But not one did. To the contrary, the uniform response seemed unarguably to be one of undiluted awe at Jesus' sacrificial love, of humbled wonder at Jesus' willingness to endure unspeakable pain on behalf of a world in desperate need of redemption. Now, 35 years later, lying quietly in my bed this Good Friday morning, I allowed myself to picture Jesus, along with the two on each side, struggling to breathe, agonizingly in pain every time he did what his tormented body demanded in order to survive one more minute. And as I did so, I teared up at the sight and the sound. I confess I wept, knowing what an insignificant moment I had just endured with a 15-second muscle cramp that had me moaning, if not groaning. I wept, allowing myself to envision Jesus enduring infinitely more pain, experiencing unspeakable agony, and yet still speaking. I heard him gasp words of forgiveness for his murderers, and of salvation to a thief who had only asked to be remembered. I heard him gasp words of familial hope to his mother and disciple, and of desperate thirst to any who might have compassion in the moment. I heard him gasp words of his fear of being forsaken by his God, and of resolved conviction that his life and his life's work were complete. And I heard him gasp words that his spirit was no longer in his own hands, but solely in those of his heavenly Father. We are the recipients of the blessing embedded in those words, of the love that brought them to Jesus' very lips in those cruelest of hours. If there are any comments or experiences that anybody would like to share, we have mics that can be carried around. If not, we can be silent for a while. I'll let the group figure that out.
Thank you, Judy. Thanks, Bob. I'm Dan Griswold. My thoughts are around the matter of response. And it seems to me that what you so gently and beautifully do in this piece is you both allow for a variety of responses to the crucifixion, as well as describe some of your own responses to that. There's a tendency in Christian piety to respond to the crucifixion mostly with guilt. I'm not saying that's the only, I'm saying that's a tendency in our faith among some of us. And there seems to be a little bit of that in your piece, but mostly what I'm picking up is awe and gratitude. And another musical example that was coming to mind is When I Survey the Wondrous Cross. Perhaps the last verse of which says, "Love so amazing, so divine, demands my self, my life, my all," something like that. And I'm wondering if you could maybe go a little bit more into the range of responses that you were aware of in writing this piece, or maybe now come to mind, and what ones you might want to move away from for yourself that you think might not be the healthiest for you and for others, or because there is a tendency, like I said, the tendency to focus solely on guilt. I'm a worm. To valorize suffering, as some critiques of atonement sometimes say. So, leave it with you.
Do you want to think about that first?
I'll take 1 minute, and then I really would be interested to hear if there would be comparable kinds of things to share. It's interesting, Dan. I don't think that I was feeling guilt lying in bed. It was a moment of perspective discovery. Less about myself, even though in some respects I found myself saying, I can't believe that I was bemoaning my 15 seconds of pain. But because it became the opportunity for me to reflect on what just, the night before I had heard and needed to remember. It gave perspective, as I had 35 years earlier with that article. And the experience, it's interesting, as I note in what I said, the incredibly uncomfortable but impelled necessity of being coached by my two mentors to stand in front of the congregation with my arms spread and describing what I do here to those folks in the congregation was a humbling experience, and that came to mind. Humbling in the sense of, this is what Jesus did by choice for all of us. That is, whether explicitly or implicitly, it's resonant in what I'm attempting to write about here.
Words come to my mind: empathy and compassion. If that leg cramp hadn't happened, we wouldn't be here talking about what we just talked about and what we're talking about now. It's amazing. Kind of redemptive part of suffering, perhaps.
David Blau. I just have a comment. I've thought for many years how the nature of symbolism in human culture, and the symbol or the object of the cross, or even the idea of making a cross. I'm always flabbergasted when the field goal kicker does that before they kick, or the pitch coming 3-2 and the sign of the cross by the batter just before, or all of the crosses that we see in church, or even we see in our jewelry. And this is not to make any judgment on anyone wearing a cross today, but I've always thought that it was odd that would we give a 7-year-old girl a little necklace with a hangman's noose or an electric chair to mark their faith. And I mean, that's what it was, a method of execution. And how could it be that has transformed in a symbol for just all the layers of both superstition and abject devotion, and all the other things in between, both culturally and spiritually. So the symbol of the cross, and there were thousands of men, almost all men, crucified in all those centuries. 500 at a time, prisoners of war, Peter upside down, possibly. And yet what made Jesus' words and his life and his symbol in dying in that way different than all those other thousands of people in that way? So that's what goes through my mind.
James Cone has written a book called The Cross and the Lynching Tree, taking to task early on one of the major theologians of the time, someone named Niebuhr, for totally ignoring this in any consideration of the crucifixion and its meaning. Somebody had a hand up.
Carol.
I guess I saw the contrast between man's inhumanity to man, the idea that we can actually work it out to make this a really painful death, that people would spend time working on that, and all the other things that through history we've done and we still do to hurt each other, kill each other, torture each other, and then compare that to God's love. And I think that's a symbol of the cross, I guess, would be the difference between God's love and the paltry love that we often show to each other. That sort of stood out to me.
I don't wear crosses, she says, wearing a cross. I only have one, it's this one. I never wear it, and this morning I looked at it and I put it on. But two thoughts come to my mind. I think of it absolutely in the way of a torture mechanism, and I think the most tortured, horrible crucifixes I've ever seen were in a indigenous village in Mexico on the top of a mountain where people live in homes made out of corn stalks, and the furniture is like a log on the floor. And you go into the cathedral, or not cathedral, into the parish hall, and there would be this have you seen them? The most tortured Christ you've ever seen, blood and bruised and broken. And I thought about being being instructed as a Protestant that in our churches we have a cross that's empty because the sign is overcoming that. It doesn't have the tortured Christ on it because Christ has lived that tortured life, as we all in some way or another live our tortured lives, and there is a victory at the end. So for me, the empty cross is different than the one that is filled with the pain. And yet, the irony of being in the most suffering places and the image of Christ is the one suffering. And so the only way I could make sense of that was to say, whatever my suffering is, God understands it because God put God's self there. God knows what it's like to suffer. So here I am. You may never see this cross again around my neck. I don't know. But this cross was made by an artisan living on the margins in Mexico.
When my husband, John DeVelder, was a missionary child, first in China and then in the Philippines, he lived in the Philippines from about ages 5 to 8, and there he saw the, I guess it would be Catholic or the Philippine people carrying on an Easter time parade in which Jesus is impersonated, and someone carries the cross and people whip him and follow him. And it is a melodramatic and gruesome picture of the suffering of Jesus in carrying the cross. And he was so shocked and horrified by this that he did talk to his parents about it, and they tried to explain to an 8-year-old that this is not how we see that, and began to point out that, the Protestants got rid of purgatory as a place of punishment so you might earn your way back into heaven after death. The Protestants do not pray for the dead because we don't need to pray for the people who have already died. And yet the Pie Jesu Domini appears to be, blessed Lord Jesus, grant them rest, which I think would refer to grant rest to those who are in purgatory. Is this a prayer for the dead? It seems like it might be that. And the whole violation of selling indulgences at the time of the Reformation was a rebellion against the misuse by some portions of the Catholic Church towards selling people an indulgence so your loved ones who were dead could get out of purgatory sooner and a soul flies to heaven as you put your money in the coffer. The abuses surrounding the exaggeration of Jesus' suffering were clear to the theologians, I think, of the Reformation. It's part of what the Reformation was about. And John was beginning to learn that as John became a hospital chaplain in his adult life. Hospital chaplains have to deal with people's false guilt surrounding suffering, that often people can be in the hospital wondering, what is God punishing me for that I have to endure this pain in order to earn, peace again? And Job expresses that idea to his false comforters. What did I do? I have not done anything to deserve this suffering. And then the false comforters say, well, you're suffering, aren't you? You must have done something wrong, so your job is to figure out what it is to lift this burden from your back. And then that is labeled false by the end of the book of Job. So it really does, what you've brought to the table today really does lay on our table questions about in what ways the crucifixion is taken by Protestants in a somewhat different way than what still would be some of the Catholic or Lutheran tradition. Are the 7 stations of the cross related to the 7 last words of Christ or not?
Not.
Okay, but that's something else the Protestants gave up. Okay, but thank you. Those are my thoughts on this. I remember John giving a sermon one time when this extremely melodramatic Hollywood feature about the suffering passion of Christ, maybe that was back in between 2006 and 2010 sometime. Yeah, that's right. It was Mel Gibson, extremely exaggerated hour of watching the suffering of Jesus. So maybe there's room for thought about the different traditions and what is and is not the Protestant way of looking at this.
Feel free to jump into your own conversation here. That's okay. Okay. I'm David Myers, and as I read this, I realized it was focused on the pain and suffering of Jesus and all those who were crucified. But I also had the reaction that Carol did. It took my mind to the incredible human cruelty that people were imposing on other people and seeming to derive some pleasure from it. Masochism, you called it. And that took my mind to the fact that that human capacity for cruelty is still very much alive today. I mean, I read Twitter feeds and so forth. I'm just astounded by how mean people can be to other people. But as I was thinking that, I'm still thinking about other people. And I thought, well, what about me? And I thought, you know, I have to admit, I'm capable of Schadenfreude, of taking pleasure in a rival's misery sometime. And is that different? It may be different in intensity, but maybe not all that different in its intrinsic nature of taking pleasure in another's suffering. That is strangely and disturbingly part of our human condition, maybe our original sin.
To lighten things up slightly, our daughter's birthday 38th birthday was last Friday, and it brought me back to thinking about her as an infant. When she was born in Kaohsiung, Taiwan, the foreign community basically went to a small clinic maintained by the Seventh-day Adventist Hospital 200 miles away, but they had a Japanese-American doctor, Dr. Nozaki, who was basically our pediatrician. And then when our daughter was a year old, we left to the States for a year, and when we came back, Dr. Nozaki was gone, and there was Dr. Chen, a Chinese-American woman. And we thought, this is great. Our little girl, who's now become conscious of doctors, is going to see a woman as a doctor. What a wonderful role model. And so one time when our daughter had become verbal enough to converse and such, and I had her in there for something, and she was going to have a shot. And Dr. Chen, this very pious young woman who I thought of as a model to my daughter, said to her, "You're going to have a shot. It's going to hurt. But think about Jesus, who had nails driven through his hand. Your pain is nothing compared to his." She just trivialized this whole thing that we're talking about today. She absolutely trivialized it, and I was aghast. Enough.
Linda's description of purgatory made me think of a line from the play Luther, where Tetzel, the seller of indulgences, is calling people up to this pot or bin or something like that. He said, and the line is, the coin into the coin into the coffer rings, and the soul from purgatory springs. But anyway, that's not my point. I wanted to respond to David. Cruel and inhumane punishment has been part of human culture since the beginning of civilization, if you can call it that. I remember several years ago reading a biography of Peter the Great by Raymond Massey, and he has a disclaimer or a warning at the beginning about the descriptions he's going to go into about the punishment of prisoners of war. And I think of the framers of our Constitution meeting in Philadelphia and incorporating in the Bill of Rights a ban against cruel and unusual punishment. I mean, this was a first that I'm aware of, that any government, any nation incorporated that into a Bill of Rights or into their Constitution. So we can be grateful to them for that.
And yet we have Guantanamo.
Yeah,
And yet we have
well,
Guantanamo.
yes, we do, but I don't, as cruel as those punishments are, I don't think they descend to the level of crucifixion or removing a person's eyes or, you know, these other just horribly tortuous things that people did to each other.
I have a question, and it's on a completely unrelated note. A fair few of you have mentioned being connected to missions in some way. And I would like to see just how many of you that applies to, because I spent 5 out of the last 10 years in the mission field with my parents. So it's completely unrelated. It doesn't pertain to this, but I do want to just ask about how many people here are connected to missions in some important way.
Raise your hands, I'd like to know too.
1, 2, 3, 3 out of a group of probably 30 or so.
Peter Bogart. I just wanted to say a brief word about pain. In 2009, I survived a pulmonary embolism. And I can tell you, suffocation, gasping for breath, is incredibly painful.
Tammy Griswold. A verse that has been with me for a few weeks from something I read is, "Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble of heart, and you will find rest for your souls." So that "take my yoke and learn from me" has kind of been sticking in my head for quite some time. And so, you know, as Bob is relating this, I'm like, well, you know, what can I learn from this? And kind of my takeaway from this is, I mean, you know, we all live this life. It's not always pleasant. It's often painful. A week ago, sometime this past week, I was watching a news show where somebody in Florida was enacting some things that made me very angry, and thinking of not physical pain, but mental and emotional pain that this is going to cause for a lot of people, and just the anger. And so what I'm taking from this is, yes, you know, this life is going to be painful, but we need to, in that pain, continue to speak and love and forgive.
Thinking about Earl Lehman and his affection for I can't remember the person's name, but he said, look for the helpers. When there's a situation where there's suffering, look for the helpers. What was the program? Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers, yes. Look for the helpers. Be one of the helpers if you can. That's a response.
He loves me just the way I am.
Sorry to come back for another bite at the apple, but it seemed to be a pause. I'm Dan. Even though I'm Reformed Protestant, more out of the liberal Reformed Protestant tradition than is common in this town, I still want to speak up, say a word in favor or an alternative view on the crucifix. And first, I'm going to preface it, and historians know this, but I want to give a plea that we ought to avoid the error of comparing our opponent's worst examples with our ideal, the ideal represented on our side. So there's this, our daughter and son-in-law live in Colorado Springs, and a few years ago we went to visit them, and we went to the Air Force Academy. And there's a beautiful chapel there at the Air Force Academy. And the biggest sanctuary, to no one's surprise, is the Protestant sanctuary. And there's this huge cross there that looks like it's from Star Trek or something. It's like space age, or it's like made out of airplane wings or something. It's beautiful, but it's a bit sterile, it felt. And you go down to the next level, and there's the Catholic chapel. And there is in there a crucifix at the front. And I was moved. And I think I was moved because it seemed to be an appropriate artistic demonstration or representation of the theological truth that Christ's crucifixion means something abiding about the reality of God. And that representation is meant to remind us that God is the God who did this. And that isn't just something from the past that we can say, oh, glad that's over. It is over once and done, but there's something about its abiding truth that I think is helpfully represented by the crucifix. Its possible worst, the ways that people might develop that in their own piety notwithstanding.
I'll speak to that personally, Dan. I hadn't thought about it till you just mentioned it. Over the years that I was serving the church in upstate New York, there were maybe 8, 10 of us that were on a worship cycle that were invited by the local nursing home to come and lead worship every Wednesday afternoon. I came to thoroughly enjoy it, partly because the congregation were there because they wanted to be there. Everybody in a wheelchair, most of them staying awake, a few fell asleep. But in that little chapel, there was a crucifix that was right behind the lectern where all of us clergy were expected to do our thing. And after a few times of leading worship there the first year or two, I found myself instinctively turning from time to time to look back at the crucifix. Not at the cross, but at Christ. And I couldn't and never did that in my own sanctuary because we had a simple cross. Now, I would occasionally refer to it, but I realized that I was drawn to the crucifix whenever I'd worship at the nursing home. And it wasn't something intentional, but it was literally, I don't like to use the word magnetic, but there was a draw to it. And it was clear when I would look at it, then I would look back at the folks in their wheelchairs, everyone would be looking at the crucifix as well. That there was something powerful about the person on the cross, and not just the cross empty, as we within the Reformed tradition would lift up. Tammy just left. I was just going to comment when she mentioned the thing about take my yoke upon you. I remember as a kid in the Middle East, my dad making reference to that particular image of take my yoke upon you. And what he made very clear was that in the Middle Eastern context, what Jesus was suggesting there is the yoke in the Middle East is always for 2 heads, not 1. Always 2, never 1, because the farmers knew that they couldn't overly tax 1 beast of burden with all the job. They had to have 2. And oftentimes, the second was the one that was learning from the elder. And what my dad suggested is, that's the image that Jesus had in mind when he says, take my yoke upon you. What he's saying is, put your head in next to mine and let me pull. It is on me to do the work and learn to labor alongside of me, and then you can manage. Never put the yoke on alone. That will kill you. And that's an image that has come back over the years on many occasions, and it came to mind when Tammy mentioned that passage.
Since Dan had the mic twice, maybe I could get away with it too. I have a question for you, Bob, as you were reading about your leg cramp, before you got into more profound stuff, you recorded the times. There I lay from 6:02 until sometime after 7 o'clock. Were you looking at the clock? All these things were going.
There are probably two different kinds of people in the world. Those of us who look at the clock and those of us who pay no attention to it. I am of the first category. The clock is, and Mary can attest to this, I sleep on my right side and there is the clock. So as soon as I open my eyes, I can see what the time is.
That's
And
another thing, too. I mean, where did Mary fit in? She's a doctor, for heaven's sake.
I was going to comment about that, but I thought,
could
no,
have
I don't need
treated
to
you.
embarrass her. She slept through it all, as far as I know. At least I was hoping she was sleeping through it all because I was moaning and she didn't need to hear me awaken her in that context.
Okay.
One comment and then we'll close.
In connection with leg cramps, does it really work to? I was always told by my husband, walk it out. Does that work?
Yes, it works for me.
It does work.
Yeah. I learned this as a member of the soccer team. Our coach explained to us when you cramp, not if you cramp. You got to lift your toes back, stretch them if need be, and you don't need to hear more about it than that.
Wonderful. Thank you, Bob, and thank all of you. Just a quick reminder, since our schedule has been revised, we have a session with Bob next week again, and then there will be 2 sessions on the reproductive rights from presented by the elders, and then a week on the refurbishment of the organ, where we'll hear some of the history of the organ, et cetera, as well. So those are the next weeks of Lent, taking us up to Easter in terms of our schedule. Thank you all very much. Yeah, thank you, Bob.
Thank you for your input and your comments.